remember the freedom that we have and the high price that was paid for us to have that freedom. And I know most of you would have been able, wherever you're at in your local places, to get to a parade or to a ceremony, but you've chosen to spend part of your day here. The World War II Museum always stops and we remember, so we'll have a moment of silence to remember the ones who can't be here to enjoy the freedom that we have today.
Yes.
Thank you. I have to say, that was absolutely beautiful. That don't try to quiet the little one, because when we're having silence and I hear the cries of a child, it reminds me of the generational things that are going on
That's right.
on a day like today. That's a divine thing that just happened. So don't ever stop those divine things from happening. And I think today is that way as well. We gathered to go ahead and remember. I want to say a word of thanks. I said something to Joe also. Steve Appleby is our director, our day-to-day director. He's here all the time. And we thank Steve for the great work that he does here at the museum. This is a passion that he has, and he makes sure that that gets carried out. We don't remember just one day a year, we remember every day of the year, so that it will always be there and passed on to other generations. Also, at the close of things, we're going to be opening up our new Holocaust room. And that's something that Steve has really been pushing for. We've talked about it. We've continued to have our Holocaust awareness grow over the years. And we've had conversations, and really Steve has not let this go until we could get it finished off. And so at the end of things, we'll actually be opening that, and you'll have the opportunity to go ahead and go into the Holocaust room with a chance to remember things that should never, ever be forgotten. In the process of that room, there are two other people that we have to thank too, and that's Dan Tennis, my son, and my other son, Clay Penner, because they went ahead and did a lot of the design and the painting and all the grunt work that went into getting the room ready. And even though they're not here, they did an awful lot to help get us ready for this day too. But I know that you came to hear a speaker, and it's a privilege that I have to get to meet some wonderful people in what we've done. And over the years of being the director and the business manager and being connected with the museum, I've met some of the best people on the face of the earth. I'm always excited when I have that first conversation and I make a call to see if somebody will be willing to come and to speak at the museum. And I'm always interested to see what kind of reaction I get. And when I called Joseph Krieger up, he didn't know me from Adam. And within just about a minute or two, there was a real connection that we had. And I said, would you be interested in coming down? He said, absolutely. Check the schedule. And we've been communicating back and forth between emails and phone calls. And I believe that what Joseph is doing is at the essence of what this museum is about. We know that the World War II generation is passing away. We're really blessed to be able to have a lot of artifacts, first-hand accounts, and things that were here. When this museum opened up, you could find World War II veterans here basically any day that we opened up. There'd be a World War II veteran, there'd be a home front worker, there would be somebody that was here in this museum that literally went through things. That was 1996, and here we are in 2014. We've said goodbye to a good many of them. I've actually had to officiate at the funerals of a number of our good dear friends that spent many hours with us here. They can't tell their stories anymore. So somebody else has to tell their stories. Somebody else has to keep the legacy alive and make sure that it stays alive and is not forgotten. Joseph Krieger is doing just that. As he's going to be able to share, he's telling not his story, but the story of Victor Breitburg and how Victor made it through the ghettos and concentration camps and survived. And is still alive, but Victor's not able to come and to tell his story. We wish he could. But in some way, Joe has picked up the torch and keeps it on. And this is something that he does not lightly, but it is a passion of his. And so it is with great honor that I'm able to introduce Joseph Krieger to you and give him your attention. And this hopefully will be the beginning of relationships that will go on. You'll get a chance to hear him even more.
We've promised to keep it a rather tight presentation. Obviously, it's not a huge book. You know, it's not the biography of David Ben-Gurion or General MacArthur, but it's a pretty good-sized book. There's a lot that's in it. It's a very different kind of biography, we believe, and that's what people have told us. So I'm here to tell Victor's story, but not just Victor's story today. We could have done just that, but I felt because it was Memorial Day, I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach as well as we begin the presentation. And then, in thinking of the bigger picture of World War II Memorial Day, and then getting into the more personal aspect. And we can't tell you all of Victor's story today. It's going to go up to a certain point. But there's room for the rest, and we can tell you those things afterwards. I don't want to cut into the presentation time. So just let me begin here, and we're going to try to make this as visually interesting as possible for you as well as I can. We'll get everything going here in a minute, and we should be okay. Yeah. Here we go. Let's see what we can do here while we're not getting our... Reset ourselves for a minute and try and get it. Shouldn't be a problem. Oh, maybe this is the problem. Jay, is this the audio thing here? Hey, Jay left the room for a minute. Because we have audio running especially for you so you can hear a few things later. I don't know why that's not working. Let me try something real quick. What's going on here? We've never had this happen before. First time for everything, right? Yeah. See if maybe. I think maybe we got it now. I hope. What I'm getting here is I'm not getting the player coming up, and my keyboard's not progressing it. So this is just the audio button, right?
Yep.
Well, let's see if maybe the mouse will get it done for us. Give me one more second. We should get this fixed.
You want to start it all over?
I think here's what I'm going to do. No, I'm going to make sure that the... let's just try something here first.
Oh, I got the other one. Oh. Yeah. Oh, they've been laughing. Oh, they've been laughing.
I can do this way. There we go.
There you go.
I can read it. No, I don't need the mouse. Just I can read it out. Sorry, everybody. Sorry to break the tension there a little bit. Maybe it's good. Beginnings of World War II, the Second War, the Second World War. All right, was among the most destructive conflicts in human history. More than 46 million soldiers and civilians perished in that war. We can't forget about the civilian casualties either, can we? It's very important for us to remember them. Many in circumstances of very prolonged and horrifying cruelty. And during those 2,174 days of war between the German attack on Poland, where it all began, in September of 1939, and then the surrender of Japan in August of 1945, by far the largest number of those killed, whether in battle or behind the lines, were unknown by names and unknown by faces, except to those few people who knew or loved them. They were not famous people. They were average people, like you and me. They were the largest number of casualties. Perhaps also numbering in the millions, even those who might, in later years, have remembered a victim were themselves wiped out. Not only 46 million lives, but the vibrant life and the livelihood which they inherited, might have left to their descendants, were blotted out. A heritage of work, a heritage of joy, of struggle, of creativity. All these things are part of everyday life, of learning, of hopes and happiness, which no one would ever now inherit or pass on. Who was the first victim of that war who was to claim more than 46 million victims? He was an unknown prisoner in one of Adolf Hitler's concentration camps, most probably a common criminal. In an attempt to make Germany seem the innocent victim of Polish aggression, he'd been dressed in a Polish uniform, taken to the German frontier town of Gleiwitz, shot on the evening of 31 August 1939 by the Gestapo in a very bizarre, fake Polish attack on a local radio station. Documentaries, good films, books have all been written about this. On the following morning, as German troops began their advance into Poland, Hitler gave as one of his reasons for the invasion the attack by regular Polish troops on the Gleiwitz transmitter. Now that is a quote from Sir Martin Gilbert's book, The History of World War II, from his very first page. He's one of the most recognized authors of World War II and the Holocaust. He was the hand-picked personal biographer of Sir Winston Churchill. And my dear friend, Victor Breitburg, knows Sir Martin Gilbert because he wrote a book about a number of young people who were liberated from the Theresienstadt concentration camp. And Victor was one of them. And the name of that book is called The Boys. It's a rather well-known book in certain circles. There are many ethnic peoples. And within those ethnic peoples, there are many cultures that make up this world in which we live. However, we are all of one blood and of one race, the human race. The Holocaust was an event that was full of horrors and heroism, contradictions and confirmations, apathy and sympathy. Some may question the authenticity of the events of some Holocaust survivors' lives, and for that reason, I am particularly attracted to what Elie Wiesel says. Some stories are true that never happened. You may have to think about that statement for a moment, but think about it, okay? Some stories are true that never happened. Only after we assimilate the history of the Holocaust can we transform the future. It may not be done in a utopian way, it may not be done in a completely idealistic way or an ideal way, but that is an idea that we must learn to grasp. Alan Rosenberg, professor of philosophy at Queen's College, has said that. The state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945 is what has been termed the Holocaust in the most contemporary sense. Although we'll find out that there were Holocausts, there were genocides long before this one, but not quite in such a unique circumstance as the Holocaust of World War II. Jews were the primary victims. 6 million were murdered. From the Greek word meaning a sacrifice by burning is the Greek version of it from the Septuagint Bible of the Hebrew translation, and that is the word from which we get holocaustos. The Hebrew term Shoah is used. You've heard of Shoah oftentimes to relate to the Holocaust. That means catastrophe in a very literal translation of the Hebrew. Catastrophe. Never before, this is why it was unique, never before had a government, one that had prided itself on its own citizens' high level of education and culture, sought to define a religious group as a race of people, seeking them out to eliminate them through an entire continent, not just within a single country. Never before had a government harnessed the immense power of technology for such destructive ends, culminating in the heart of Auschwitz, a death camp that at its peak processed 10,000 Jews a day, and that was not the only one, and Jews were not the only people who were killed in the concentration camps, even by gas and cremation, as we'll find out in a moment. Never before had a government summoned their best and their brightest people to mobilize destruction and use mobile killing units, which were called the Einsatzgruppen, to systematically kill approximately 1.5 million individuals in 2 years. Never before had a government sought to dehumanize a group through such a devastating use and systematic use of propaganda that included the use of film, education, public rallies, indoctrination of youth, radio, newspapers, art, and literature. That is a study that can take us at least a 4-hour seminar, just even touch on that subject. And I've been part of these teaching seminars at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington last summer, and I will be part of the Belfer National Educators Conference again this year at the United States Holocaust Museum this coming July, where we focus on how to put these kinds of lessons together and then teach them in schools and to civic groups, churches, and so on. The word Holocaust has been appropriated by many to describe ethnic and other atrocities, and not without controversy. These include African Americans have used the term, Native Americans have used the term, AIDS activists have used the term, even environmentalists have used the term Holocaust. Now, Alan Rosenbaum, a professor of philosophy at Cleveland State University and the editor of the anthology, Is It the Holocaust Unique? Perspectives on Comparative Genocide, has commented on this very debate and has something very interesting to say. Any attempt by any group to keep a monopoly on language is doomed to failure, because anybody can use any language they want, and the term Holocaust has such power as the paradigm case of genocide that any group wanting to make a superlative case for its own experience would naturally want to borrow it. I guess he has a pretty interesting thought there when you think about it, though we can understand the conflict, the controversy, and even the pain that this can bring to many people in light of having that kind of a discussion. Well, there were pre- and post-World War II atrocities. There was the Nambia genocide. That was in South Africa. There was the Armenian genocide, which, by the way, in France, just 2.5 years ago, has been completely recognized as being what it was, and it is illegal to speak against the Armenian genocide as not being a genocide. That's a pretty big step forward for any national government to make a move like that in regards to genocide, when we consider that the United States government has not even had a formal policy on genocide until the second year of Barack Obama's second term. And it wasn't anything that he was particularly interested in doing. That's not the point. I'm just giving you a historical fact. And we haven't had one prior to that. Think about that. Okay? Then there was also Stalin's genocide of Ukrainians and others, the rape of Nanking by the Japanese, Mao's Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, the Cambodian killing fields. The pattern of the Nazis' premeditated Holocaust, their term was the final solution, was similar to the intent and structure of the Armenian genocide, which was also really based on genocides that were perpetrated by the Assyrians and the Babylonians in ancient history against the Jewish people and against Egypt, by the way. First, intellectuals and community leaders were arrested and executed. The next targeted groups were forced from their homes, marched for hundreds of miles, being deprived of food, water, taken somewhere to be summarily executed. Massacres were indiscriminate of age or gender, for example, in Nanking. And in more recent incidents, rape and other sexual abuse was commonplace. The number of people murdered by the Nazis is less than Stalin's forced starvations, his gulags and other means, or Mao's deliberate famine. However, the specific intent to implement a final solution for Jews and to rid the Reich of national people, the Poles, that's a whole other background we don't have time for today, is putting those two together, we just don't have the time, was something that makes the Holocaust unique. Roma, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals were also specifically targeted all throughout Europe, and it must be remembered that this genocide, this is the most unique point of uniqueness, for me anyway. You must remember that this genocide, unlike the others, was occurring just before and during a world war. It was not an internal, tribal, regional, or inter-ethnic conflict such as our recent atrocities like those in Rwanda, the Baltics, Sudan, Darfur, and Myanmar, Burma. Today, Syria has also been classified by every major institution in the world that does these things as being a genocide for our age. This was an international, transnational attempt to eliminate people and their cultures from whatever would be the ultimate boundaries of the Third Reich. Now, here's just a quick map that showed 2,000 years of Jewish life in Europe. We don't have time for that today or this map, but let's go on. During the course of this Holocaust, we had the victims. Now, on this triangle of looking at how the victims became the victims, 85% of people involved in the time of the Holocaust and where it was taking place within all the geographic borders were bystanders. We don't put the term innocent in front of it because that just can't wash. In some circumstances, yes, but more and more is being revealed in many places, especially the most recent report that's come out within the past year, that there were now almost more than 200 concentration camps, more than anyone ever thought before. More people died, and less are we seeing that there were more and more innocent bystanders. There were less innocent bystanders than maybe people thought of before in some of these circumstances. Perpetrators were only less than 10% of the overall populations involved where the Holocaust existed. Rescuers from many different nations were 0.5%. Think about those figures. Who were the victims? Elie Wiesel wrote in 1995, "It is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims." Okay? Jews, habitual criminals, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti, or the Gypsies, Freemasons, Soviet POWs, African Germans, political opponents, handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles. Notice they're both in red. There's a reason for that. We don't have time today. Immigrants, American POWs, a lost part of American World War II history, which, because today is Memorial Day, and as much as I'm going to share with you, Victor, this is something I will focus on for a few minutes in honor of our Memorial Day celebration and our veterans today, and evangelical Christians. These were the main victims of the Holocaust. It doesn't mean there weren't others that aren't classified. American POWs. When the United States joined the war against Hitler, many brave young Americans were captured and imprisoned. Jewish soldiers were at a very special risk because they wore a special dog tag with an H on it, which marked them out as Hebrew. Anybody that saw them knew they were Jewish. If they were not understanding yet what Hitler was doing by the time they were engaged in the war, and they were marked if they were ever captured. And this helped the Nazis single them out for mistreatment, and even more than just mistreatment. One group of Jewish GIs was sent to the brutal Berga on Elba concentration camp, which had the highest fatality rate of any camp where American POWs were held. Other POWs were sent to notorious concentration camps like Buchenwald and Mauthausen, where they became victims of the machinery of the final solution. Meaning what? Our American POWs just died like anybody else in the concentration camp. Whether it was a Jewish person, a gypsy, a Jehovah's Witness, or whomever, they died just like they did, in the same ways. They were not treated as prisoners of war. Mitchell Bard has written extensively about this in his book, The Abandonment of Americans in Hitler's Camps, and the knowledge that our government had of these things. Renowned Holocaust authorities like Elie Wiesel and Sir Martin Gilbert have spoken highly of this particular book. On April 4th, 1945, the commandant of the camp, received an order to evacuate Berga. This was at the end of a chapter of the Americans' ordeal. The human skeletons who had survived found no cause to rejoice in this flight from hell. They were leaving friends behind, and they were returning to the unknown. And fewer than 300 men survived the 50 days that they had spent in Berga. Over the next 2.5 weeks before the survivors were liberated, at least 36 more GIs died on a march to avoid the approaching Allied armies. The fatality rate in Berga, including the march, was the highest of any camp where American POWs were held. And nearly 20%, and the 70 to 73 men who were killed represented approximately 6% of all Americans who perished as prisoners of war during World War II. That doesn't seem like big numbers, but if you put it in its context, those numbers are staggering. And they died not as prisoners of war. They died as people in concentration camps. All right? There's a distinction. This was not the only case where American Jewish soldiers were segregated or otherwise mistreated, but it was the most dramatic. The United States government never publicly acknowledged that they were mistreated. In fact, one survivor was told he should go to a psychiatrist. Officials at the VA told him he had made up the whole story. In October 44, the first Allied officer, Navy Lieutenant Jack Taylor, the first one to drop into Austria, was captured on December the 1st by the Gestapo. severely beaten, even though in uniform, severely beaten and considered as a non-prisoner of war. He says in an interview, "I was taken to Vienna prison where I was held for 4 months. When the Russians neared Vienna, I was taken to this Mauthausen concentration camp, an extermination camp, the worst in Germany, where we have been starving and we were beaten and killed. Fortunately, my turn hadn't come. 2 American officers at least have been executed here. Here's the insignia of one as he holds him up in his interview, a U.S. naval officer, and here's his dog tag. Here's the Army officer executed by gas in the camp." There were, question, how many ways did they execute them? 5 or 6 ways. By gas, by shooting, by beating, that is, beating with clubs, by exposure, that is, standing out in the snow, naked, for 48 hours, and having cold water put on them, thrown on them in the middle of winter, starvation, dogs, use your imagination, and pushing over a 100-foot cliff. Now, those were American POWs. Yet we must also understand, though this may seem like it's said to be a small number, it's huge in its context. But then beyond that, we have to understand this, that in the Japanese campaign, American POWs, the numbers were staggering, and they were not treated as prisoners of war many times either. Though they didn't have concentration camps in the same way that they did in Germany, we know that many American and other Allied force members were murdered, not held as prisoners of war. The victims. It is true that all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. Elie Wiesel. No one will ever have completely accurate figures concerning deaths. I just told you about these staggering new numbers that are coming to light now. No one will ever have completely accurate figures concerning deaths in the ghettos and the camps, but the accepted number is roughly 9 million overall. Now, please look at these figures. 9 million overall. Now, specifically Holocaust-oriented, okay? When we consider that 3 of those 6 million were Polish Jews, 6 million were Jews, 3 of those 6 million were Polish Jews, and 2 of the 9 million were Poles, Catholics, Christians, and others, that figure is significant. Add it up. 5 million out of the 9 million all came from within the borders of Poland, Jews and Gentiles. That's an incredible figure. Why? Because if Hitler had his way, before he gave up on his overall elimination of the Poles as well, as a subservient class of people, as he considered those Slavs, and then his focus was on the Jews, he kind of backed off on the Poles for a while as he focused more and more on the elimination of the Jews. But within that one country, there is no other numbers that match that out of one country for loss, specifically because of the Holocaust against 2 targeted people groups. And many of the Jews that lived in Poland, yes, there was anti-Semitism in Poland to some degree and so on. There is again today, sadly. But many Jews lived there wonderfully, contributed to the culture. Victor's father served in the cavalry in World War I, and he never just considered himself to be Jewish. He considered himself to be a Polish Jew. He had a country. He had a nation. He wasn't just an ethnicity. And that's the way it was for many if you study the histories of their lives. Well, we'll go on. A personal view of the Holocaust. Many Holocaust survivors will say it was not just our Holocaust. The event of the war was universal in its scope. The suffering in one way or another affected more than just those who perished in the death camps and the concentration camps as part of the genocide. Yet individual stories do help us to humanize and personalize and cause us to relate in some way beyond time, events, and people that are only hours on a clock, dates on a calendar, or people with famous names and some facts attached to them. So today I'd like to share with you, in some brief moments, some of the story of my dear friend Victor Breitburg, a survivor of the Lodz ghetto, 4 concentration camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Remsdorf, and Theresienstadt, from where he was liberated on VE Day by the Russians on May the 8th, 1945, his 18th birthday. We just saw him 3 weeks ago. This is Victor and me when our book was first published, signing a few copies for some friends. This is us 1 year later on the anniversary. We printed a small hardcover edition kind of for ourselves. This is Victor and I, May the 2nd, 2014, on Long Island where he's staying right now. This is our team. A book like this can't be produced. I'm just doing this quickly to let you know. I may have been involved in all this, but this can't happen without the way we did it, without the help of a lot of other people. This is our team. Number 1, Ronnie Seibel-Leibowitz, the president of the Jewish Genealogical Society in New York City, researcher and accomplished speaker, and her husband Jerry Leibowitz is the website's manager for the Jewish Genealogical Society, for Lodz, Schentlichs, and a number of other related Holocaust sites. Ronnie is the person who is responsible for first introducing me to Victor Breitburg. And we've grown to be very, very close friends. Next on our team, of course, there's Victor. There's Ruth Parker, Victor's companion and good friend after his wife died in 2009. And Ruth was very significant in the years that I spent working with Victor on the book and the days down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, of just taking care of us in many ways. Then there's Deborah A. Krieger, who is my proofreader, my copy editor, my photography when I couldn't take pictures, and my videographer when I couldn't take video. Oh, and by the way, she's sitting back there. There's one other fact about her. This August the 13th is the 37th year that we've been married. She's a significant part of this project. And then there is D.K. Lubarsky. If you saw the cover of the book in the beginning slide, and you'll see some things later on, Diana, this is a picture that we took when we met together for the first time after collaborating on the book over a couple of years. We never met face to face, and we had never met Ronnie face to face either until 3 weeks ago in New York City. But this is at the St. Petersburg Holocaust Museum exhibit, where her sculptures are on exhibit, and where that same day they received copies of our book into the St. Petersburg Holocaust Research Museum Library. Our book is also in the Yad Vashem Library in Jerusalem. It's in the Imperial War Museum in London. There are copies in the United States Holocaust Museum, in the Boca Raton Media Center Study for Holocaust Studies in Florida, and here there will be as well, and other things. But enough of that. This is David Lubarsky, and David was our photographer. He's a professional photographer in New York City. David and I had never met face to face until 3 weeks ago. We spent 3 hours in his studio talking about future projects for the museum right here. He did all the reworking of our negatives of Diana's sculptures for our print edition in black and white and for our color EPUB version of the book. And then this is Paul Gast, a survivor of the Lodz ghetto and the Ravensbrück concentration camp. We've become fast friends as well. And this is one day early on doing research for the book. And Paul is an accomplished and well-known Holocaust educator in the state of Florida and takes trips to Europe. And so we just had lots of things to talk about and share with one another. The turmoil I prevailed over reaches throughout eternity. And yet I come to enlighten your innocent minds. With the wisdom of experiences, I make my afflictions known. I have learned it makes my people stronger. And I willingly speak of my torture. I am not a victim. No, I am a survivor. This is a poem written by Sylvia Menendez after Victor spoke to Mrs. Cohen-Willard's 10H English class at Amityville High School in April of 2000. This is how she interpreted Victor's story. An entire class did this. I have the stack of poems at home, and we've printed a few of them in our book. Where did it all begin? Well, for Victor, it began in a little shtetl like this. It was called Kaminsk. Shlomo Victor Weinman was probably born in Kaminsk, Poland. This is Victor's grandfather in 1857. He came from a very Grand Orthodox Jewish family. He was capable of writing and reading several languages, and of them they were Polish and Russian and German and Yiddish and Hebrew. And in the town he was known as the man who writes letters in several languages. I'm just going to be showing a few slides because the village of Kaminsk was obliterated within the first day of World War II in Poland. But this is very similar to what Kaminsk would have looked like, and where Victor grew up as a little child for a few months and then moved to the city of Lodz, to just give you a feel of what it was like back then. And his grandfather was an exemplary Jew. He was known in his town. He was a melamed. That means he was a teacher. He was a husband and conscientious father. He served in the Russian army during World War I and during the Russo-Japanese War. I should say, not World War I, excuse me. That was Victor's father. He was a man of stature, not only in height, but also in character. Now, Kaminsk was a shtetl between Pietrzków and Bełchatów, about 90 kilometers south of Lodz. It was a typical little shelter. This could have been Victor's grandfather. And he's standing together for a picture. There are no extant pictures of Victor and his family other than two, and we'll see them later on. And in this little shtetl, was like hundreds of others in Poland. Half the population was Jewish, half was Catholic. Neither group particularly cared for the other. The harsh life was not discriminatory. And the result was that they tolerated and depended on each other. Why? Poverty was their mutual enemy. And so they got along. In the center of the shtetl, there was a market. And every Wednesday, the Polish farmers brought their commodities there. Money was seldom exchanged. Most of the time, everything was bartered, as they had done for centuries before. And on the right side of the market, there was a Catholic church. And there also, just a little distance away, was the synagogue for the town. And in those days, and in a small shtetl like that, almost everybody was Orthodox as far as Judaism was concerned. Now, his grandfather was 23 years old, and then he met a young girl, and her name was Sura Kaila. They were engaged, and within 1 year they were married, and at the time of their marriage, his grandmother, Sura K, was 14 years old. Now listen very closely. She was 15 when their first baby girl was born. That child's name was Nakayita. 8 children joined the family over the next 8 years. Over the next 8 years. So in a sense, you could insert kind of like Fiddler into the Roof at this time of history and before Victor was born. And Victor has wondered, and he and I have discussed about it, how many men might have thought, like Tevye, when he said, Lord, you made the lion and the lamb. You decreed I should be what I am. Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man? Right? And so that may have gone on in that village for days and months and years throughout history that those same words may have been spoken. Well, there was plenty of affection in their family. The rule of the home was Torah. It was everyone's responsibility to help and to serve others, not only members of the family, but anyone in need. For it is written in the Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 1 and verse 2, that the world depends on 3 things from the Jewish perspective: Torah, worship, and loving deeds. Torah, worship, and loving deeds. And on April the 12th, 1902, his 38-year-old grandmother, Sarah, was in labor with her 8th child, whose name was Chava, which means Eve, if you translate it into English. And by the age of 16, Chava had many suitors. Her eyes were looking at a then 16-year-old, lanky, blonde-haired boy whose name was David, who was in the Polish cavalry. Victor and I figured out he must have lied about his age. Well, she did not see him for the next 3 years because of World War I. Shlomo Victor passed away, his grandfather, that year in 1918, to the great sorrow of his family and everyone in town. 2 of his children, this is very important, much later in Victor's life, Nakayita and Hilda, were not there because they had emigrated to the United States. And in 1921, David returned after fighting in World War I and then fighting against Russia for Poland's freedom, which they won. And for the first time in 400 years, Poland was free. David and Chava were then married. So when his mother was in the late stage of her first pregnancy, their grandmother received a visa from their daughters, who were in America. She kept postponing the journey until the first child would be born. Didn't want to leave until then. That day arrived on May the 8th, 1927, when Victor was born. At that time, the borders of the United States were closing for Eastern European Jews. And when someone left for America back then, it was like they were gone for all of eternity. She arrived on the shores of America, settled in Brooklyn, New York, and remarried. The Holocaust took its toll on their family. From the children, the grandfathers, the in-laws of the family, of the Weinmans, only 2 out of 54 people survived. Victor and his cousin Rachel, whom at first, after the war, he didn't realize was alive. They found her at a displaced persons camp in Germany. She finally was sent to America through Jewish resettlement. She passed away in 2010. Victor's father, David, left Kaminsk only a few months after he was born to find a place to live in the city of Lodz. Many famous people came from Lodz, including the famous pianist Arturo Rubinstein. He's from Lodz. Many people. Now, with a population of over 500,000 people back then and a vibrant textile industry, living in Lodz made finding a job much easier than many places in Poland. And once there was nothing to entice him to go back and stay in the shtetl. He had no prospects for employment. They moved to Lodz, where he had a rather successful business as a tailor. Now, when Victor was a young boy, at the age of 4, he was sent to the Keter, the elementary school, to learn the basis of Judaism in the Melamad's home, which he hated with a passion. It wasn't his studies that he disliked. The Melamad was an old man with a white beard who always coughed and sneezed. He smoked like a chimney and smelled like a camel. As he tutored us, he constantly exhaled cigarette smoke in our faces, and we involuntarily inhaled. And those were the days before anyone used a term like secondhand smoke. So, He became addicted to smoking. His father also smoked. And between those two people, Victor says, I became a cigarette junkie at the ripe age of 4. Well, my father caught me trying to smoke half of his cigarette, and I got a shellacking with a belt on my bottom. The good part was, I never had to go back to the cheder. I got a private tutor at home. When he was 5 years old, his brother Felix was born. There's a picture of schooling, similar. And then when he was 5 years old, his brother Felix was born. Now, these are the only extant photos that Victor has of any of his family. We'll learn in a few minutes he had a sister who was born, no photos of her. And so there's obviously Victor a little older than Felix there, but there's little Victor with David and Chava. Okay? Well, then what happens? Well, it doesn't take much that the dogs of war are being loosed, and Kamensk, like any other area, is preparing for its outcome. Then comes September 1939, and I'm not going to show any of it to you today. This is a short little 5-minute video that shows the invasion of Poland, but we really don't have time for it today, so we're going to bypass it. But what occurs, once the war begins, thousands of troops were normally stationed there, but as the war began, there was a saying, Poland refused with this slogan to be occupied. We are not going to give one button from our uniforms. A couple of days later, German forces invaded Poland, and on the first day of the war, Kamensk was bombed to oblivion. The only building that was spared was a church. And after a couple of weeks of ferocious and incredibly brave fighting, Poland gave up their entire uniform. The unexpected attack on Kamensk caused many fatalities among the civilian population, including Victor's cousin, Shlomo, who was the oldest son of his uncle Yitzhak. The face of their city was changing rapidly because now it was going to become a ghetto. This is an important part about the city of Lodz. As short as we can do it. This is the very first city outside of Germany to become completely Germanized. Its name is now Liesmanstadt. Every street name is changed to a German name. Every business and industry is taken over and Germanized. Poles no longer own anything. Whether they were Jews or not, they owned nothing. The Germans occupied it. This was going to be their first occupied model city of the new Reich outside of Germany. It's the first ghetto established. It was the last ghetto to be dismantled. This year, by the way, is the 70th anniversary. This coming end of June, going into July, June of the dismantling of the ghetto in Lodz. And so this made things obviously very difficult. And on February 8, 1940, the order was given to establish the ghetto. It's supposed to take 1 day. It took weeks. On April 1st, the ghetto was officially closed. Then it was sealed off. No one now goes in. No one comes out. The rest of the city was separated from. The Jewish Council was set up, and Mordecai Rumkowski, a very controversial figure, we don't have time to go into that today, very controversial figure, was chosen to be the Altesta, the elder of the Jews in the city of Lodz. As far as Victor knows, there were only 2 survivors, Morris Konchevsky and himself, from 20 families who lived there until the ghetto was evacuated in August 1944. Meaning families that he knew, not just families, obviously. Now, there's an interesting thing that went on in that ghetto as well as many others. There was smuggling. And thanks to a neighbor who was smuggling food into the ghetto, Victor's father, David, joined them. And so they were doing off a little better than other people, but there were always risks. There were 6 people involved in that smuggling ring, including his father. The head of his smuggling ring, his name was Hulko. He was a horse trader before the war. He was a very sleazy sort, had a lot of arrests. During this time, he had many connections with the Polish underground, which the city overall in Lodz had no solid underground connections, had no plans for revolt. They were very isolated because they were such an important part of the industry of Germany. That's where most of the war uniforms, buttons, pants, jackets, and things like that were made for the German armies were made in Lodz. But it wasn't very well organized there at all in any sense, as it was in other places. Among the laws in the ghetto were the curfews. 7 p.m., 6 a.m., signs warned you if you get caught between the curfew, you'll be shot. Make a long story short, his father was arrested, should have been executed. He was not. He was sentenced to 9 months in jail. Victor never really understood why. They figured there must have been a bribe somehow that was paid off. And Victor completely verified that this really happened to his father when he revisited Poland in 1990 and found the records of this, that this actually did happen. It wasn't some memory he made up in his mind, it was true. In 1942, September the 4th, Mordecai Ronkowski, chairman of the council, makes an announcement, a demand by the SS to deliver over 24 to 25,000, sources vary, Jews to be shipped out of Lodz. Now, the people in the city of Lodz didn't know where they were going. They just knew they were going to be resettled. But where they're being resettled to is the first execution gas chambers in Chelmno. Before this, there were shootings and other things, hangings, and that now the gassings will begin at a very small scale before they begin to grow. So these are actual photos of Jews from the Lodz ghetto boarding on the trains to the death camp at Chelmno, passengers in a train car from Lodz going to the end of their lives and not knowing it. All Jews under the age of 10 and all over the age of 65 were taken to the train station for resettlement within 8 days. And the deportations get worse and worse as time goes on. Now, the SS and Jewish police, once they began this first deportation, surrounded the hospitals, forcibly removed all of the patients. It didn't matter if you were there for a checkup or if you were very ill. The SS went through the list of patients, and if anybody was missing, they had to report to their deportation center, or another member of your family was arbitrarily chosen to take your place and shipped out. Anybody who resisted was shot on the spot. People jumped to their deaths. They were herded like cattle to various assembly points at 2 of the hospitals. From there, they were taken to the Ragodzis railway station. And what hadn't been known, that by this time now of this larger number of resettlements, that since January 16, 1942, they were being shipped to Chelmno. This killing camp was 2.5 miles away from Chelmno, Nadnerum, 31 miles northwest of Lodz. Carbon monoxide was piped into the hermetically sealed cargo area of the killing vans. Permanent gas chambers had not yet been developed. It's coming. And here's a very important point in history that gets missed. All the Jews from 5 other communities around Lodz have been completely emptied out of their communities and have been sent there since December 7th, 1941. Martin Gilbert writes, on December 7, 1941, as the first 700 Jews were being deported to the death camp at Chelmno, Japanese aircraft attacked the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor. Unknown at the time, either to the Allies or the Jews of Europe, Roosevelt's day that would live in infamy was also the first day of the final solution. That's an incredible, incredible fact. Panic sets into the ghetto. By 1943, another year of resettlements, out of the ghetto, suffering, people attempting to live some kind of a life in the ghetto. Victor's father dies in the ghetto on June 18, 1943, at the age of 41. His suffering is over. The family has to go on. June of 44, another resettlement, 10,000 or more people shipped out. When the ghetto was isolated from the rest of the city in April 1940, the population was approximately 160,000 people. Now the population was down to 75,000, including women and children who were not able to work. They're at the lowest count ever. And now Victor and his family are forced out of their hiding place. They're all discovered, as many other families are. Many of you have heard those kinds of stories. And they're going to say goodbye to Lodz forever on August the 15th, 1944. These are actual photographs of people. Victor could have been in this very crowd when this picture was taken on the train to Auschwitz. As their turn came, we each received a loaf of bread. Jewish policemen assisted the mother into the train. Once mother and his sister Sarah were in, Felix and his brother, they climbed aboard. It took a while until the train was filled up. Then he heard the door slam. They heard the door latch lock behind them, and they looked around to try to count how many people were on the train. And he says we must have been the last train loaded because we had a little more space than the people in the other trains. We didn't move for about 2 hours. Then the train slowly started to go forward. Goodbye, Lodz. I felt that we'd never come back once we entered Germany. In a matter of minutes, Lodz was behind us. There was a great silence. We feared what was ahead of us. I thought, after the war, we will try to go to America. On the 3rd day, all of a sudden, there was a commotion. We went through a gate, and the train stopped. There was silence. We knew we'd arrived. Everyone put on their backpacks and waited for the doors of the train to open. I heard my heart beating. I was not at ease, and my lips were trembling. My mother gathered us in her arms and told us to stay together. If for some reason we get separated, we should not forget that our meeting destination is with my sister in Brooklyn. She kissed us, and I hugged my mother. I said, nothing is going to happen to us. We're going to stay together. I took Felix's hand. He pulled it away and said, take care of Sarah. I'm 12 years old. I'm able to help myself. I smiled at him. Boy, he certainly was growing up. I was surprised at his reaction. He turned out to be such a good-looking kid. He was a Breitburg, blonde and blue-eyed, and I'm a crossbreed between the Weinmans and the Breitburgs. Waiting for the door to slide open was hard. We didn't know what to expect, and at that moment I felt we should pray to the Almighty, please let this nightmare end for us, that one day we might go to the promised land and serve God for all of eternity. Well, abruptly the door slid open, and the men in the prison uniform shouted out of the train now! Make it fast! And we hurried off the train, and I looked around and saw the SS with their dogs surrounded us, and I was not so sure that we were in Germany, and a chill went through my body. And what's happening? The words were on my lips, but not spoken. Women and children to the right, men to the left. That was the next command. I decided to stay with the family. I was only 17. I wasn't a man. Go with the men. I will take care of the children, Mother said. But we promised each other that we were going to stay together. I want to go with you, I begged. No, you have to go with the men. Please go. And before I had a chance to answer, a man grabbed me by my arm and pushed me towards the column where the men were. Listen to your mother and go with the men, his voice boomed. Who is he to tell me where to go? I thought. I turned around. I didn't see my mother and my siblings. All right, I thought, for now I will go with the men. But, the minute I am settled, I will find them. There's too many people to fight now, but nothing will stop me from finding them. Well, all kinds of things were going on as they first arrived there. We have to go through this a little quickly, just some of these images, to stay on track here. Watching my time. And then comes the registration, and then comes the roll call. This is called the appel. Victor was herded into a wooden barrack. On each side there were rows of bunks 3 levels high. After all of us were inside, a whistle blew. We were told to line up on each side. A tall, heavy-set man with a whip in his hand came in and looked around. I am the capo of this barrack. But I'm going to tell you, I will only repeat once. Remember how young Victor is. A young boy, 12 years old, 15 years old. By now it all starts. What I'm going to tell you, I will only repeat once. You are shit. You are vermin, a cockroach, and an ant. If you don't want to die, you better do what I tell you. I don't care if you live or die. In the morning, you'll hear a whistle. You'll get up and wash yourselves. You're going to get some bread and a piece of margarine. When you hear another whistle, you'll step outside. When you get out, there you're going to stay in 3 rows with your hats on. When the German officer comes to the barracks, you will hear my order, hats off, and all you'll do is take your hats off, and you will all do it at the same time. Understood? You're going to be counted. We call this the appel. Now, you're going to practice, all of you, taking the hats off at the same time. Later, when you hear the whistle, you will step outside for the appel. I said to myself, what are we doing here? Whatever's going on here, I've got to find out where they keep the women and the children. No matter which trustee I asked, I couldn't get an answer. And this went on for a while, until a man stopped in our barracks and inquired about a particular person. He said to me, are you from Lodz? Yes. I'm looking for my son. This is the last barrack left then? He didn't finish his sentence. Can you tell me, Victor says, what are the women and children's barracks? I felt that I caught him by surprise. Did you come yesterday with the transport from Lodz? Yes, I came with my mother, my 12-year-old brother, and a 4.5-year-old sister. This time I saw his face soften up, and he had tears in his eyes. Come here. Do you see the smoke above the barracks? I began to respond. Don't answer me. Just listen to me. 1 hour after you arrived, they were all gassed and cremated. My son was on that train too. He just turned away from me, still murmuring. They are all dead. All I could comprehend was the word dead. It's impossible, I thought. He wants to scare me. They promised us we were good workers and they needed us. Maybe his son is dead, but not my family. The Lodz ghetto, which was the first and the last ghetto, had probably been more isolated from outside information than any other in Poland. And when the early deportations were taking place, We had no idea that the people were going to Kelno to be executed. Based on our production of necessary war supplies for the German army, many thought that we were indispensable. So I ran to the barrack to ask the capo if what this man had said was true. And as I entered the barrack and looked at the other inmates, I knew the man had told me the truth. All I wanted to do was find a place to think, and when I found it, I just could not sit. I promised my father that if something happened to him, I would protect the family. Why did I give in to my mother to leave the hiding place? Wouldn't we have been better off if we had all been killed together? Why did she push me away to go with the man? At that point I spoke to God. Why did you spare me? Please take me. I don't care if I live. I don't remember what happened to me for the next couple of days until the man spoke to me. And he said, if you die, then Hitler will succeed. Therefore, you have no choice but to live. Maybe somebody is alive. Don't say Kaddish yet. I thought, yes, he's right. I will refuse to say Kaddish until I find a witness who saw them die. I grieved for them, but now I wanted to live. I thought, the man is right, and I must thank him. I have to survive. I looked for the man, but I never found him again. Victor worked a number of jobs during his incarceration in Auschwitz, Buda, Buchenwald, Ramsdorf, Theresienstadt camps. From grooming horses to cooking potatoes, shoveling ashes of the dead, cleaning the kits for SS officers, disarming bombs, he made lifelong friends who survived. He witnessed many horrible things, as did all who were in the camps. And yet he led a fruitful life after the war. Well, some did not. So, if we have just a couple of minutes, I know my 45 minutes is there, but I don't think we can close if you don't mind. Just a couple of minutes. Would you like to hear from Victor himself? Anybody mind? Do you mind sitting a couple of minutes? We can't hear the whole thing. This is one of many interviews I've done with Victor. This one runs an hour, but we're not going to obviously play for that long. We're going to play some. This is Victor speaking about after his liberation, when he is repatriated to England for a year and a half, learn his English, and then what goes on there. You're going to hear just a little bit of what life was like after the war from Victor.
The question was, how did I feel, or what did we do, or how we did it, flew into England, and where? Actually, it was in Carlisle. That's a part of the Westmoreland area of Scotland in England. Well, as we were flying down, and we saw that what happened in Germany, and when we come to England, we all felt very high for a simple reason. For the first time, we are in a free country which does not interfere with us. We landed in Carlisle, and when finally, and cars were waiting, and help were waiting, and nurses were waiting for us. They had played at the table for food. When we let off, that was the first thing we wanted to do, is to sit down and eat something. And they were so nice, and they were all around us. And that didn't last too long. About three or 4 hours later, a bus came and picked us up, and we went the other way around. We went to England. Well, we wound up in a place called the certain parts of England, which is called Windermere. It's called after the name of the lake. It's Windermere Lake. It's one of the nicest places in England. Again, the same thing. We were trying to be fed into drinks and so on. Nurses came over and check out whether we are right or not all right. In my case, I felt fine. I never had any problems. I got off the plane. I looked around where I was. And I didn't kiss the floor. I was smiling. And then people were taking pictures and photography and so on. And that was the beginning. When it became a little late there, they took us in to certain houses. And when they opened up the doors from those houses, we were shocked. Each one of us had a house, an apartment for ourselves, or a place to stay. In that room, there was water and showering and everything. It used to be a place for the English, not actors, for the Air Force.
Okay, that's about all we can do today, but just let me share one quick little thing. A little later on, Victor will tell you how when they went back then again and started to eat in the dining room for the first couple of days, all the food on the table and even some of the dishes would be disappearing. And the people who were feeding them would come up and say, what's going on, what's going on? They were hoarding the food because they were so used to not knowing if they would eat the next day, and they had to be broken of that habit. One of the other things they would do is when they would all get up in the morning and go for food or whatever, they would just see everybody automatically, all these young people, you know, marching. They said, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is how we live. This is how, no. Here you can walk. You don't have to march anymore. You're allowed just to, so it took them a while to acclimate to all of these incredible changes. Well, thank you very much. You've been very, very gracious. Thank you for your time. And